Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our Big Tent Climate Talk this quarter. This conversation is a quarterly series that spotlights leaders in the climate community. This year, we will focus the conversation each quarter on one of our main policy planks. Today, we are going to be discussing climate smart forestry with a trusted expert and partner. At CCL, we know that climate change requires a variety of policies and perspectives to solve. This is why we work under a big tent that includes people from the right, the left, and every spot in between. We're here to learn more about all the work we can do together. For those of you who don't know, my name is Kammien, and I'm the manager of stakeholder engagement and government affairs here at CCL. My work focuses on building the coalition in our big tent and advocating for legislation. Today, I am so pleased that we're going to be joined by Joel Pannell to discuss some of his work at American Forests. Before I officially introduce him, as always, we're going to set the table with our ground rules. As CCLers, we love our focus and we're open-minded. Today's focus is on listening, learning from the experience of a fellow climate advocate. If you bump into a moment of reaction where something is shared that you think or feel differently about, lean into it, see it as an opportunity to learn from the larger climate movement and better understand that perspective. Learning from each other is how we're going to get this done. So with that, I'm going to introduce our guest. Joel is the Vice President of Urban Forestry Policy and oversees efforts to build and promote American Forest's positions on a range of urban forest policy related social equity issues. He works to build and maintain relationships with policymakers, senior government officials, partner organizations, key stakeholders, and other related entities to advance policies centered at the intersection of urban forestry and social equity. Over the last decade plus, he has played a leading role in expanding equitable access to public land, including the creation and significant growth of the only federal grant program addressing park equity in cities, as well as the launch of the 10-minute walk program. Prior to joining American Forests, he led Sierra Club's Outdoors for All campaign and directed urban policy for the Trust for Public Land. He is a graduate of the University of Maryland and Virginia Commonwealth University's Center for Leadership. Joel, is there anything that you would like to add for folks on this call, or anything that I missed?
No, Kyle, that was a great introduction, and I'm just happy to be on. I've had the opportunity to engage with CCL a few times now, and it's always been such a pleasure to discuss these issues with your staff and your membership. So I'm just looking forward to today's conversation.
Well, thank you so much. For the audience, I'm going to start off with a question for Joel. He's then going to do a little presentation on what he's been working on, what American Forest is working on. And then we're going to open up the floor for Q&A. Don't worry, there will be plenty of time for audience Q&A. So with that, I'm going to jump right in. Joel, can you tell our audience a little bit about your why behind your work in American Forests and how you personally got into the climate movement?
Absolutely. So growing up in suburbs of Richmond, Virginia, I didn't imagine I would be an urban forest lobbyist. I was really into organized sports. I was into politics, and so my educational background and my early interest and experience led me to get my first job in policy working for the National Recreation and Park Association. So I was representing park and recreation associations and agencies across the country on some of the federal policies that would benefit them and their members. And then over the last 15 years or so, I've just sort of been naturally pulled more into the climate, particularly the climate justice space, as I have focused on, some of the things you mentioned in my bio, increasing equitable access to parks, trees, and the outdoors. Growing up in the suburbs in a leafy green neighborhood, I kind of took for granted everything that meant. But having family, friends, and others who grew up where they're really experiencing things like urban heat island and lack of access to nature and green space and water, all the impacts that has on people's mental health, physical health, and even things like economic opportunity. And so as I again got sort of pulled more into the climate justice side of this work, I really saw how that sat at the intersection of all these other issues that I personally cared about. And it's also just been a great professional space to work in, to be able to work on policies that really advance that in a significant way, some of which we'll talk about today. And so that's a little bit of my journey and how I got here.
Well, that's great. And I think our volunteers really appreciate hearing that. And one of the things you touched on that I think is something we all run into is climate is such a big issue that it intersects with so many other issues, no matter how you slice it and dice it, and that it really is something that affects all of us and touches so many different parts of our lives and our society in different ways. So I really thank you for sharing that, and I know that our volunteers appreciated hearing it. Well, I know you have some slides that you want to show us, so why don't you go ahead and jump into those if you'd like, and then we'll kick off the questions on the back end.
Absolutely. And I will try to be pretty brief here because I know the Q&A is the most valuable part of the session. Is my screen showing okay? So I just want to give a little background for those that aren't familiar. American Forest is the oldest national nonprofit conservation organization in the United States. We will celebrate our 150th anniversary in 2 years. And so we've partnered with public and private stakeholders since the beginning. We helped with the actual creation of the Forest Service. And so, pun intended, our roots do in fact run deep. More recently, if I can get to, okay. And more recently, our work has really sort of been bifurcated in 2 areas. So there's our resilient forest work, which is really about, working in large landscapes and on large scale reforestation projects. Sorry, I couldn't get that out quite. And then the work that I personally focus on in our policy department, which is our urban and community forestry work, which we've called Tree Equity. So I want to give just a quick overview of some of the resilient forest work. I am not an expert on this. We have other policy experts who work on that. So I'm happy to answer questions as best I can on this, and also just to collect questions to make sure that folks are getting the most accurate and up-to-date information. But our resilient forest program is really focused on climate resilient reforestation to scale on Western public lands primarily. And so that's largely driven by, if you read the news, if you're paying attention at all, you know that wildfires are just being supercharged by climate change. They're growing in frequency, they're growing in intensity, they're hotter, bigger, and more destructive than ever. If you look at the chart there, you can see that just in the last 2 years, California alone has suffered from about 4 million acres of forest fire. So that's equivalent to 5 times the state of Rhode Island. And the damage from these forest fires, again, is increasingly damaging. And so 40% of that land is unable to be restored naturally. And so we do need natural climate solutions and interventions to address that. Also has, obviously wildfires in and of themselves are catastrophic, but they also have implications on things that I personally was not aware of until I started working in this space. So if you look at just like biological threats, so white bark pine, which is a tree that is like a high elevation tree in the Northern Rockies, the Sierras, and the Pacific Northwest. And so we've lost more than 325 million acres of white bark pine due to invasive species, and other increased threats due to climate change. And so this impacts not only the forests themselves, obviously, but it impacts things like when grizzly bears and other bears don't have that white bark pine to feed off of, they are now going to lower elevation, which impacts, coyotes, squirrels, birds, and even human interactions. And so the impacts of this really are extrapolated over many, many things that we don't always see at face value. So we need climate resilient and nature positive reforestation. And so that's a lot of what we work on. We're doing this through a number of things, but one is through science informed and rapidly scaled reforestation supply chains. I cannot get that word out today. We're also, we've done the Reforestation Hub in partnership with the Nature Conservancy and working really closely with the Forest Service to identify exactly where those 142 million acres are nationwide that present a reforestation opportunity for us. We are, again, partnering with lead landscape collaboratives. We're using applied science. We're doing supply chain solutions to make sure that we have science-based plans that deliver these solutions and unlock greater speed and scale, including technology development, infrastructure, workforce, and financing mechanisms. So that, again, was a very quick run through of our Resilient Forest Program. I'm happy to answer questions about that later, but am now going to talk about the work that I'm most familiar with, and that is what we at American Forest call Tree Equity. And so a map of almost any city in America A map of tree cover is also a map of race. It's a map of income. It's a map of race in ways that transcend income. And that's due largely to just the way that we've designed our cities, historic policies like redlining, where we've decided to invest and where we've decided to put concrete and other things of that nature. And so the result of this is that we really see a lot of discrepancies in terms of resilience to climate change, health, public health implications, as well as, again, like I said, economic opportunity and job creation. So what we did is we launched something called treeequityscore.org about 2 years ago now. And so this is a tool that anyone with internet access can use. You can actually get down to the neighborhood census block level scale and see how your neighborhood lines up with surrounding neighborhoods in terms of tree canopy, unemployment, other socioeconomic demographics, surface temperature, and things of that nature. And so you can really, it's designed to be used as a data-driven support tool that anybody from President of the United States to a kid in their neighborhood who wants to really figure out where are there opportunities and where will we gain the most benefit from increasing our tree canopy. Just a little bit more on what that tree equity that we currently have means. And so it really is life or death implications. Extreme heat kills more people than any other natural disaster, kills more people than hurricanes and tornadoes combined. Scientists predict that if we do not act in a significant way on climate change, that number of 12,000 annual deaths from extreme heat per year in the United States will grow to 100,000 by the end of this century. And so, that is not that far off. And that is just a huge life or death implication. And I think about, 2 weeks ago, the USDA announced $1 billion for the Urban and Community Forestry Program. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. And the event was with Senator Booker, who was a key champion for this issue on the Senate Agriculture Committee, USDA Undersecretary Dr. Homer Wilkes, John Podesta from the White House. We're all at this event, and we were sitting at a park across the street from the school. Afterwards, the principal of the school said, I just wanted to let you all know I'm so thankful for everything that everybody here has done. I've lost 2 children in the last 2 years to asthma. They actually died from asthma. So when we talk about this as a life or death situation, it really is. It's not hyperbole. And cities like Newark, Detroit, New Orleans, Richmond, Virginia, where I'm from, across the country, you see childhood asthma rates are 4 times what they are in surrounding counties and the rest of the state, largely due to lack of trees, increased air pollution, and everything that entails. And so this, again, really is something that has life or death implications. Also has huge impacts just on climate generally, on our energy use, on our mental health, and just a number of things. So this is, to me, just such a critical issue. And I'm grateful every day that I get to wake up and work on this. American Forest, our goals for 2030 are that we do have 100 cities who are actually moving in an actionable way towards tree equity. These 100 cities should represent a diversity of sizes and contexts. When I talk a little bit more about the Urban Community Forestry Program, that program has benefited about 84% of the country. And so it's for communities of 2,500 and up. So it's not just your big cities, but it's really, again, 84% of the country where more than 4 out of 5 of us live. We hope that each city is using an inclusive, holistic, and rigorous approach that includes front-line partners. I'll talk a little bit about some of the tools that we have to do that and working in partnership with others. And then also, again, the economic piece to me is really critical when we talk about expanding tree canopy. It's not just about planting new trees. It's also about protecting existing canopy, where you sometimes or often will get your greatest climate benefits. And that also creates tremendous workforce opportunities to protect and maintain the existing canopy or trees that are newly planted. And we believe that those jobs should be intentionally for the people who live in these areas, because again, the areas that the neighborhoods that are suffering from a lack of tree canopy are most often those neighborhoods that are also suffering from a lack of economic opportunity. All right, and this is our program model. So these are the many different ways that we see as sort of interventions to help cities move towards tree equity. Really starts with creating an inclusive partnership. So in Phoenix, for example, in the Phoenix area, we have worked to bring together more than 50 stakeholders with our partners there broaden community engagement to make sure that folks, again, in these neighborhoods are involved in local urban forest planning. Data-driven priorities, so our tree equity score, as well as other data and other tools, federal tools and tools from other partners. Really, tree equity commitment. American Forest is the U.S. lead of the 1T.org chapter. And so when we talk about things that folks could do to help out, really encouraging your city, if they have not made a 1T pledge, to do so, or to make some sort of public commitment to advancing equitable tree cover. Having a plan that is actionable, that you can move on. Tree protections, that could be ordinances or different things to make sure that we are adequately protecting existing canopy. Nurseries, again, on the reforestation side, I mentioned nurseries. There's also an issue on the urban side. And so, and that's also a big job creator, something that people can start small businesses on. I was in Detroit with a bunch of folks last fall to announce our Detroit Tree Equity Partnership, and was able to talk with a gentleman there who had actually started 2 tree nursery businesses and was employing a lot of local youth. And then all the way up to urban wood. And, you know, wood utilization is also a really exciting tool that we can do and build businesses out of long-term sustainable urban forestry models. And so, you know, talked a little bit about some of this already, but this is what the role that American Forest sees in helping cities overcome their barriers so that they can achieve equitable tree canopy. And so really those tools and techniques. One thing I didn't mention is we've also worked with the Forest Service on a climate adaptation and health guide to make sure that the trees we're planting now are trees that are going to be climate resilient and optimal for human health 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, because as climate change increases the threats to trees through you know, pests and invasive species and extreme weather events and drought, we're actually seeing that the genetics and the tree species of trees that we need to plant is changing. And so how are we ahead of that curve? Career Pathways, which I have already mentioned. Career Pathways is a specific program that American Forest has in workforce development. We have a pre-employment curriculum that really gets very granular about how you help people who have employment barriers enter the workforce, and helping them with transferable job skills, folks who have been justice involved and are returning citizens, folks who are underrepresented in the tree care industry. How do we really work with the industry and work with those communities and workforce entities to make sure that those opportunities are met? And then funding the movement. And so what I work on as someone who focuses most of my time on federal policy, we were in the Inflation Reduction Act able to secure $1.5 billion for the Urban and Community Forestry Program. That's a program that's typically funded through annual appropriations at about $35 million a year. And so to get $1.5 billion was just a tremendous windfall and a huge success, testament to years and years of work from many folks. And so that a lot of that funding is actually available to the public now. And so almost done with my slides here, but again, 2 weeks ago, the USDA Forest Service did announce that of that $1.5 billion, $1 billion is now out. Proposals are due June 1. So I've been on lots of different calls and presentations to talk about that. That is quickly approaching, and we want that funding to be utilized as much as possible, particularly in areas that are most in need for increased, again, equitable access to tree canopy, for those increased public health outcomes and increased economic opportunity. So you see there some of the criteria, some of the priority criteria that the Forest Service has put out on this program, but that's something I imagine there will be a few questions about, so we can definitely get into that. And then just our general policy priorities moving forward. And so again, much of our focus and my personal focus is on implementation, not only of the bipartisan infrastructure, not only of IRA, but also the bipartisan infrastructure law. The replant provision of that was a huge win on our reforestation side. Cross-agency collaboration. So, we've had multiple conversations with CEQ, different folks in the White House who are really looking at how do they coordinate on all of these different opportunities to invest in communities around forestry and particularly urban tree planting. And so obviously the Forest Service has the Urban and Community Forestry Program, but IRA also created or provided billions of dollars to EPA and to DOT, both of which have urban tree and urban heat island mitigation components to them. And then congressionally, I think most folks will tell you they don't expect a lot to happen this year. The Farm Bill is due to be reauthorized, which has traditionally always been a bipartisan bill. And know that in the Senate and the House, they've been, House actually created a forestry standalone subcommittee this year under Chairman G.T. Thompson. So I'm really excited about that increased focus on forestry. And so there are some opportunities there to sort of reinforce, I think, what was done in the last Congress. Baseline appropriations for the Urban Community Forestry Program, even though there's that $1.5 billion out there, there is the need to continue to increase baseline appropriations and make sure that states who've been the traditional partners to the Forest Service in delivering this program have what they need to adequately address urban forestry issues in their respective states. And bipartisan solutions, one of the reasons I'm always so happy to talk to CCL is you all have that, not just bipartisan, but solution-oriented focus. And so having worked with you all on things like the Growing Climate Solutions Act, the Trees Act, which has been introduced many, many years, but unfortunately has not yet got across the finish line. There's things like the Trillion Trees Act and a number of other bipartisan pathways that we see on forestry. And earlier this week, I actually did a presentation with Bloomberg on the urban and community, Bloomberg Philanthropies, and a number of mayors were on to talk about the urban and community forestry opportunity. Chair Mallory from CEQ was also on, and former New York City Mayor Mike Bloomberg said everybody loves trees. Whether you're blue, red, purple, no matter where you live, what demographic, trees are really, just nature's best air conditioner. They're nature's best air filter. Pretty cool to climb and jump on when you're a kid, or even maybe an adult. And so, how do we bridge the gap on some of the political division and really come up with solutions, policy solution-oriented things that can get across the finish line? And so that's, again, another reason why I'm so grateful for the continued opportunities to dialogue with CCL. And I believe here's my contact info. And there again is the event in Detroit with Senator Stabenow, who is the chair of the Senate Agriculture Committee, was just so instrumental in getting all of the forestry provisions into the Inflation Reduction Act and replant as well. And so our CEO, Jad Daly, is there as well. But with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Kyle.
No, that was terrific. Thank you. I know that I learned plenty, and I have no doubt our volunteers did as well. I made a few notes that I kind of want to go through, and then we'll open it up to the volunteer questions. First of all, I did not realize that American Forest was that old. That is awesome. That just was kind of mind-blowing to me. And also the history of being a part of establishing the Forestry Service and everything that's fascinating to me. So happy anniversary, and would love to hear more about maybe some of the plans or hopes for that kind of celebration, if you have anything to share there. But also more generally, when we were talking about the reforestation piece of the work that is not your day-to-day, but some of the things that struck me were, we're painting the picture of the ecosystem disruption that we're seeing, and how this problem becomes an even bigger problem as it kind of snowballs, for lack of a better term. But I thought the Reforestation Hub seemed like a really great tool. And the question on that, is that a tool that our volunteers can use for any purposes, or what is that tool's intended use generally?
Yeah, I think it is a publicly available tool. I have not really played around with it or used it much. I know that it's, they consider it kind of like a low-tech, scalable, solution-oriented tool for climate change. Mm-hmm. So that's something I could definitely follow up with in terms of, if someone is really interested in that and they want to do that, what would be the best approach? And so that's something I definitely would follow up with you on. Okay,
thank you. And then pivoting more to your day-to-day work with the tree equity issues. I thought that the treeequityscore.org tool seems like a great tool, especially for folks like ours who are in communities all across the country, to see, be able to see what their community and their surrounding communities' scores are. And can you talk about a little bit about how you've seen that used in a grassroots capacity, or how you think our volunteers might be able to use it that would be a beneficial application?
Yeah, absolutely. So just by way of anecdote, we were talking to Miami-Dade County, to the chief heat officer there, actually, that they, I think Jane Gilbert was the first chief heat officer in the country. They realized that that was such a key issue. They needed to treat heat like they treat hurricanes in South Florida. And so she noted that a lot of the local community organizing groups, community advocates that would show up in the past to these city council meetings talking about criminal justice reform or affordable housing, were now showing up to talk about tree equity. And they were, having in their hands their phones and showing, the exact neighborhoods where they thought the city should be prioritizing investments in tree canopy. And so that's just one example, kind of for us, a perfect example of how we intended for this tool to be used.
Yeah.
I will also mention that sort of the next iteration of Tree Equity Score is something that we call TESSA, Tree Equity Score Analyzer. And so you can actually get in like parcel by parcel and sort of plan scenarios. If we were to plant here on this parcel, what would some of the eco-service benefits be? How would that impact larger, more comprehensive forestry plans? That's something that's a little bit more hands-on. And so you can't get that just from the tool. But again, I think from folks using that tool and having that in their hand, it's a great feature for them to be able to, again, either show up at a city council meeting, to write to their members of Congress, to be involved in a lot of the short-term and long-term planning that cities are doing. And it's often across agency, public works, your planning department, your parks department. And so that's really sort of how we intended that tool to be used. And then again, at grass tops as well. We've seen mayors, we've seen members of Congress really play with that tool and see, hey, this is how this neighborhood I grew up in compares to the neighborhood I live in now, and how we can really pinpoint where we need to make these investments.
Well, that's really helpful. Actually, a follow-up question that did come in from a volunteer related to that. Are there resources in Spanish or other languages to help communities learn about tree equity scores or inform them about their tree equity scores?
Right now, we don't, but that I was at a call earlier this week with our comms team. That is definitely in our plans to talk about broadening community engagement. Multi-language is something that is definitely at the top of the list, and we should be rolling out hopefully in the near future. Great.
No, that's that, and when that does roll out, we'd be happy to share that as well if we can be helpful in that capacity. Thinking about what you were just discussing with, having people in their community showing that score to whether it's a city council or some community leader, thinking about that and the tree equity programs that you were discussing, I think you said there were 100 tree equity cities with a tree equity program, if I remember the number from your slide. Is there a role for grassroots folks like CCLers to play in getting more of those? And what would your recommendation on that approach look like? How should they go about that?
Yeah, so I think our 2030 goal was to have 100 cities moving actually towards tree equity. We're actually doing some analysis right now to see how many cities are actually doing that. I would say one step is making that public commitment. And so reaching out to your local decision makers, whether that's city council, mayor's offices, whatever it may be, and encouraging them to make some sort of public commitment. Tree equity is the term that American Forest uses, and we would love for it to say tree equity, but it really, again, is about increasing and expanding access to tree cover in those neighborhoods where it's needed most. And so, we've seen a number of cities across the country: Chicago, Las Vegas, Boise, Idaho, cities of all shapes, sizes, political leanings have made commitments. And so I think that would be something that really would be a great use of your members' time and advocacy powers, would be to get some of those local commitments.
Great.
Secondly, I would say too, just again, looking at ordinances vary city to city, but there are a lot of different ordinances that could be put in place to protect existing canopy. And we're even seeing in some cities now, when we're talking about urban areas, zoning and other issues can get very complex. And so I think that's a great place for people to show up as well, to make sure that when we are zoning our cities, when we're planning new development, when we're looking at our built environment across the board, that healthy long-term and short-term sustainable urban canopy is part of that. And so I think there's a number of ways that folks can show up and advocate for that as well.
That's great. Those are really great actionable suggestions. Thank you. More anecdotal observation though, as you were going through it, I was really struck by how full life cycle that your program is, talking about creating economy around it, creating jobs, creating community around it. And as a personal anecdote, in college, a job I had to make money for a number of years was I worked for a tree service company. So I can attest that just even maintaining trees, especially older, very large trees, is a lot of work, and it will provide lots of jobs. There was always work for us, especially if a storm came or something like that. But that was hard work, but it was good work, and we did it. I did it for years. So I can attest to the fact that it is a good job and a needed job.
That's great to hear, Colin. Made an honest man out of you. So
well, I appreciate you saying that. Well, I'd like to jump into some of the audience questions that have come in. I know I was able to weave one in there, but I'm going to move through some of these other volunteer questions that have come through, and we'll do what we can to get through as many as we can with the time we have left. So the first one I have here is, what are you doing as an organization to assist the cities that are making these announcements about tree equity programs, or trying to get them off the ground? What's the organization doing to help them, create or improve their tree programs?
Yeah, so we have a number of deep dive cities that we're working with, that we have staff embedded in, and so really, again, making plans that they come up with actionable, and figuring out based on what the city says they need. Some cities are really prioritizing workforce development. Others may be prioritizing nursery capacity. Others may, again, want to look at, the species of trees they're planting, or the wood utilization aspects. And so we are, to the extent that we have capacity, working hand in hand with those cities. We're also trying to make our tools as widely available as possible. And so, really going towards sort of a hub model, and making sure that cities can really click on what they want to learn more about, get more resources and information on, and advance that work. Then again, I will continue to plug the 1t.org as the lead of the U.S. chapter. That's another opportunity for cities to come together, to make pledges, and also to do some peer-to-peer learning. That's something else that we're doing, not just through 1T, but through American Forest. We've got a tree equity workforce network. We actually gave 3 grants about a month ago, $300,000 grants to different organizations who are working on local workforce development in different capacities. And so, again, creating those networks of peer-to-peer learning is something else that we are really focused on.
That's great. And no doubt you're also, as you're with these folks you have embedded, I'm sure that you're learning best practices and things from that work that will help inform the future of it. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Great. So another question that's related to the same topic. What's the best resource? Sometimes it's difficult when we're trying as a constituent, when you're trying to dig through ordinances or learn policies your city might have in place. How can folks, what's the best method for them to learn whether or not their city has a tree equity program?
Individual cities, the best method to learn about your city would probably be to first look at tree equity score and see sort of where you rank, and then that'll give you a sense of the neighborhoods in your city. And then I think learning as much as possible about how your city funds and plans for tree planting and maintenance. And so that's sort of going to be on an individual city basis. There is a resource called Vibrant Cities Lab that we have worked on in partnership with the Forest Service, that, and I can throw that link in here as well.
That'd be great.
But that really has a number of tools, a number of case studies, and different research applications that can give you, I'm trying to put in the chat here, can give you sort of an idea of steps that you can make locally at the local level to advance tree equity in your city.
That's great. No, thank you. Along these lines about how to engage locally, and thinking about how, cities aren't a monolith. There are a lot of different communities in every city. Do you have data or anything like that on how different communities within a city, different communities of color, et cetera, are engaging with one another? Looking at it from the sense of this particular question is looking at it from the sense of, how are the communities informing one another? Are they working together? Are there challenges with this? How is this process? What have you learned from this process about how that engagement is going?
Yes, and if the question is it within a particular city? Is that
No, this is a higher level question than that. But if you have an anecdote, that would be really helpful.
across? Okay, no, I was meaning like they're trying to figure out how different entities within the city are working together, or if it's more about how cities are learning from each other. Just want to make sure I understand the question.
I think it's communities within the cities. That's my understanding of the question.
Yeah, again, I think that's why at the beginning sort of is building an inclusive partnership. And so, yeah, and by way of anecdote, the mayor of Albany, I believe earlier this week was giving an example of, again, just sort of broadening that tent of community engagement. So this is the big tent conversation. So I think that's appropriate. But traditionally, you know, urban forestry is sort of been a niche field traditionally. And so not everyone has the great experience that you had in your younger days of working with the tree care company. But I think a lot of folks, myself included, really, you know, we took trees for granted. We like trees, but we didn't. The field of urban forestry sort of has been traditionally a niche field. But when we see the impact that tree canopy has on all of us, again, you know, more than 4 out of 5 of us, the vast majority of the country, we're learning that it's something that really intersects with all these different areas. And so expanding that community engagement tent, so you're not just working with the tree care companies and your local urban forester, but you're talking to the folks who come to the public housing and affordable housing meeting. You're talking to the folks who are interested in criminal justice reform and how that can align with all the different economic opportunities we've talked about related to tree care, that you're talking to folks who are really your climate advocates and may be interested in electric vehicle, you know, electrification and things of that nature. So bringing all of those folks together from the beginning of the process, aligning priorities and figuring out what makes sense. How do we give folks a real voice in the partnership and leadership in the partnership?
Yeah,
that's what we've seen be successful, so that it's something that's happening with and for communities and not to communities. Because again, you know, doing this work, I'm always going to be an advocate for trees, and I think trees are great. But we've learned, you know, cities like Detroit, where they were decimated in the 60s and 70s by you know, emerald ash borer and invasive species, and they tore down a lot of trees. And so when the city and some local nonprofits, you know, decades later came in wanting to plant trees in certain communities, there was a lot of lack of trust of the city and of these entities. And, you know, folks felt that trees had been cut down to surveil their neighborhoods and for other not so well-intended reasons. And so I think, you know, you can't assume that you can just show up at a town hall meeting and say, hey, trees are good for everybody. Well, your neighborhood needs trees. You really need to sit down, listen to what folks' priorities are, and then have a conversation together about how more trees and better removing hazardous trees, taking care of the existing canopy, planting new trees aligns with the priorities that they've identified in their community.
Thank you for that. And I think, you know, my biggest takeaway from what you just outlined is, as far as, you know, looking at just from a CCL lens, when we talk about climate conversations, you know, one of the big things is always listening, and listening to a community, identifying what they need, what they see as the issue, and how you can work together to address those issues. That is a way that works for everyone, and benefits all of you. So I think that you just kind of identified something for us that is a lesson we've learned in climate broadly that applies in this same policy area. So that was a great answer. Thank you for outlining it. Pivoting a little bit in the same area, but you mentioned the Farm Bill, and one of the volunteers was wondering, are there, you know, specific areas of the Farm Bill that from American Forest perspective, CCL can help, you know, support priorities for climate smart forests?
Yes. So I think we have, I think, 4 Farm Bill priorities that we've identified. There were a number of letters that went up to the Hill. I know that they're sort of in the committee. I think conversations are sort of at the committee level right now, but they're engaging on the Farm Bill, and many individual offices have been dropping sort of marker bills. And so I think at American Forest, we've identified that, you know, one priority really is reforestation, nursery, and genetic resource program. So that's a program within the Forest Service's state and private shop. And so, you know, we're asking to expand that program to at least $10 million per year. We're also asking to establish a new competitive grant program for reforestation research, nursery and seed collection, addressing some of the workforce needs through state agriculture forestry experiment stations, working with universities, research organizations, and private entities. Thirdly, we are asking to establish a nimble loan and loan guarantee financing for nursery program to service public, private, and urban reforestation recovery needs. And then lastly, to just continue to elevate and prioritize urban and community forestry. I think there's the specifics on what that exactly looks like is sort of getting into a lot of nuance, and I think we'll see where all of that lands. But I would say just broadly, those are American Forest priorities, and if folks really want to engage on the Farm Bill, then we can certainly connect afterwards and on some of those more specific policy geek details that we can talk about.
Great. And this is maybe a bit more of my own interest, but you mentioned to increase the funding to $10 million a year. What is it funded at right now? Because in a federal budget sense, $10 million is very small, as we know.
It is very small. I don't know what RNGR is funded at right now, because again, apologies that I don't work on those.
That's all right. I asked you a weedy question. That's my fault.
Yeah, no, in the weeds of politics is where I live. So I should know that, and I'll get you an answer on that as well. So always, if you're asking for increase, you should always know what the baseline is.
No problem. One thing that Brett flagged for me, Brett dropped this in the chat too. So more of a comment than a question, but as a kind of supplement to today's conversation, there was a training on April 18th with Dr. Susan Cook-Patton that walked through a little bit of the reforestation hub. Brett posted the link, so if volunteers want to go there and learn more, watch that recording, they can learn more about some of that there as well. A couple more questions, and then we'll get you out of here on time. One question is, you mentioned a little bit about kind of studying, well, first of all, that the genetics of the trees and how they're interacting based on climate change is changing. So what types of trees are you all finding offer kind of, I'm sure it varies regionally, maybe, but most protection to be safe from some of the extreme heat we're seeing?
Yeah, that again is going to be specific to region and locale. And so before I even start to attempt to answer that question, that is something, it's as valuable as it is to maybe your members to hear me talk sometimes. It's also equally valuable for me to get these questions, collect them. So I will again point you to this climate adaptation and species selection guide that we've developed with the Forest Service, Great. Which we give a lot of detail, like specific to different regions. And so maybe I will just throw the link up to that.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's a great resource.
So I think, yeah, that can really answer again, because it does vary so much based on region. And it is part of the Climate Cities or Vibrant Cities Lab site that I mentioned earlier. And so here we go.
Well, with that, I'm gonna ask you, thank you, folks, the link's in there so you can learn more about that there. Last one's a little bit more of a softball for you. So what is American Forest planning to do to celebrate its 150th anniversary?
I am not sure yet, but okay. I know that it will be a big celebration. I think we have just been in a fortunate place with replant and now with IRA, trying to make sure that all this federal funding, public funding that we have advocated for is implemented in the most effective way. Yeah. And so I think we will we'll have some time to catch our breath over the next few months and then plan for that celebration. We will be sure to invite you and our friends at CCL.
We'd love to be a part. Thank you.
Imagine it'll be a big celebration, but I am not, and I think we have some other folks who are already starting that planning, but I've not been part of those conversations. But no, thank you for highlighting that. And again, we wouldn't be here for 150 years without partners like CCL, and so we're happy to share that celebration with all of you.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. I know our volunteers appreciate that as well. Well, we're at the 45-minute mark, and this has been terrific, but we'll wrap up. Just wanted to give everybody a brief reminder of where you can find today's recording to share with those that couldn't join us live, as well as Brett's contact information. You'll also see CCL's website and American Forest website if you'd like to get more involved and active. We'll be back later this year with another event next quarter. But thank you again, Joel. You all are doing amazing work at American Forest. I know I learned a lot today. No doubt our viewers learned a lot, and so will those that watch this recording later. So thank you for your time. And we really appreciate you working so closely as a partner with CCL.
Absolutely. Feeling is mutual. Thank you, Kyle, Brett, CCL team, and all of your members. It's been a pleasure to be on with you today, and we look forward to continuing to collaborate in the future.
Thanks, Joel. Bye, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration.
Like what you hear? Recommend us to your friends and make sure to give us a 5-star rating. It helps us show up on other listeners' feeds. Feel free to pass on any suggestions for future episodes in the comments as well.
And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.